Mike, how are you? Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
It's incredibly special to be able to talk to you because I've covered a bunch of the different disciplines that make up symbolic systems, but I haven't covered the thing that brings everything together. And there's no person more apt to talk about it than you, given your current role. So why don't you tell people what do you do?
Sure. Well, I'm a developmental psychologist and cognitive scientist. So that's my day job doing research. I study kids' language learning and just more generally using data to understand children's development. But I also have an administrative role here at Stanford, which is that I'm the faculty director for the Symbolic Systems Program, of which you're an alum, and actually of which I'm an alum also.
Yeah, and it's this incredible, weird, quirky program that I think, is not very widely replicated, at least in name. And there are, counterparts in other universities that are similar, at least in some dimensions. But I don't know if there's an exact overlap in terms of curriculum or in terms of the particular career paths that the alumni of the program have followed. I want to go back to your experience as a symbolic systems undergrad. And in fact, arriving to Stanford and deciding to take symbolic systems, I think the major has some more brand name recognition today than it had around your time. So I want to know how you were thinking about it when you decided to take this leap of faith.
Yeah, so I was a kind of an artsy kid from New York. I was really focused on music, actually, mostly in high school, but I had intellectual interests. And when I was choosing colleges, I went to my top choice college visit weekend and looked at my life in front of me as an electronic composition major and thought about that as a kind of career and lifestyle. And then I came out to sunny California, stayed with my amazing host, who was a really cool student who was into like rock climbing, and he was a SimSys major at the time. And he took me along with him to this logic and philosophy course, and it was super deep and cool. And maybe it was the weather, maybe it was the subject matter, but I was totally sold. And it seemed clear to me at that point that there was kind of, I still love music, I still play music and think about music a lot, but there was more intellectual depth that I could find, and in philosophy and in cognitive science, and so that really set me on the path. And from there, I had this very prototypical SimSys major experience of finding the book Gödel Bach by Douglas Hofstadter, which is this amazing book. I love it. Right, within arm's reach. Amazing blend of the arts and logic and computation and philosophy, and uh, that reading that summer before coming to college really made me confident that I had found a program that was going to serve this really deep interest that I had. So uh, from there, it was pretty easy. I was declared in my freshman year, and it was like, yeah, this is what I'm going to do.
No, and I think it's awesome, and I want to geek out with you about it because I think there's one thing from the insider's perspective of having seen how all these frameworks connect and the mysterious connection between logic and music or math and geometry and extrapolating that all the way to human behavior and the limits of logic and reductionism and where there are some people who find those topics naturally very compelling, and there are some people who kind of look at them from a distance, not feeling like they can engage with them, at least not in the same way that you and I can. But there's also a different case to be made that symbolic system students and in general any kind of practitioner of these kind of fields has the role to express this to other people and eventually mold society and shape society according to what they learn in these principles. So how do you strike that balance of your inner geek wanting to I mean we could talk about music and logic and the connection between the two for the whole 2 hours, or we could also just go item by item. How do you strike that balance?
I mean, I think I'm an academic, and so I love to look at these deeper connections between things and the formal structure of problems. Like that's fundamentally what I love. What I've seen in the current generation of SimSys majors is that they also love those formal descriptions of problems, but actually the tools have progressed sufficiently that they can use those tools in those formal descriptions to think about real social issues and social problems, as well as the kinds of more purely formal or mathematical problems that initially motivated me, and that's kind of the substance of Gödel, Escher, Bach. So it used to be that all the prize-winning theses or the kind of top theses in SimSys were all really about neuroscience and computer languages and formal languages, and we still have those. But we also have a new generation who are using like NLP tools or social network theory or statistical methods to investigate social problems, and that's been really exciting to see. So I think that dichotomy that was like really very clear for me, that SimSys is not about the social world, that's getting broken down in part just because of the revolution in computational social science, in natural language processing. Like all of these kind of fuzzy systems that felt a little harder to characterize, actually now their whole field's built around characterizing them.
And we can keep language as a central theme there because it's the vehicle that will be able to express all the different things that we need to, and it's the thing that eventually began your academic path too, right? I remember the first time I ever heard of you was you were giving the guest lecture for Psych 1 about the psychology of language and the Whorfian hypothesis and the Piraha. And, so that in and of itself is a bombshell we can explore. How does language fit into your academic path that then materializes into your role today?
I mean, that was actually that experience that I was talking about in Psych 1 was really where I got started. I answered an ad on the SimSys listserv at the time, right after I got to Stanford, and said, want to know about language, want to like solve philosophical puzzles about language using experiments? And I said, sure. And I ended up working as a research assistant with a person named Lara Boroditsky, who's a graduate student in the department at the time and later became a professor, and has done a lot of work on how languages vary and how that shapes people's cognition. But she was a fabulous mentor to me, and I worked with her, and I started thinking about these issues of like, does having different words for color change the way you see colors or remember colors or reason about colors? And that was a fabulous introduction for me to this idea that, yeah, you can do psychology experiments, but they can bear on philosophical topics. They can hook in with, linguistic variation. They can help you think about cultural variation. So really like just a tremendous amount from that first research experience that set me thinking about language and thought and cognition and culture, kind of all together.
And I mean, and this in and of itself, I personally can relate to how this can, lead to a lifetime devotion toward these topics. And well, I guess like we've been talking about symbolic systems, but we haven't really addressed the most difficult question in all of symbolic systems, which is what is it? So how would you, now that you've gone through the arc of being an undergrad, doing your academic research in psychology, and then now having the administrative role running the ship, what is it?
So this is actually one of the most fun things about my job is I get to go to graduation and I get to talk to all these parents who are like, so now are you going to explain what my kid is studying? It's fun, and it's also a really joyous day, right? Graduation is fun, so they all cut me a little bit of a break when at the end I haven't completely explained it. But what I say to them is that there's a maybe I don't say it quite this way, but there's an intellectual heart of symbolic systems, which is that we're focused on minds and machines and essentially any connection between them, like machines that are made to think like minds, whether our minds are machines, minds and machines working together, right? This combination of entities that process symbols and all the questions that arise around that connection. So from a kind of an intellectual perspective, there's some really fertile territory there. But also from an educational perspective, what that does is it sets you up, if you study those systems, to then jump off into all the most interesting connections in the university, from human-computer interaction to neuroscience to cognitive science to computer music to computational social science. All of these places where if you study systems like language, systems like formal systems for reasoning, logic, systems like computational systems, you get that backdrop and that set of tools, the formal and the philosophical and the computational and the empirical, you put them together, you have the ingredients to really move forward with essentially any interest you have in any of these really cool, hot areas, from from all those I named to, of course, now the big one, artificial intelligence. And so SimSys majors are just set up perfectly to follow their interests in all of these creative directions, basically.
Yeah, there's something that I really appreciated about the fact that it was an interdisciplinary program and that it forced you to adopt different modes of thinking. Computer science and algorithmic thinking has a very particular way of reasoning. Philosophy has a similar, but a bit more, a bit fuzzier than the cold hard logic of coding. And then psychology, which is way more empirical and way more collect experimental design and going through the whole scientific method. Um, but the flexibility of switching between those modes of thought really is I found an asset in navigating big life decisions, where some decisions you have to make as a philosopher, some decisions you have to make as a psychologist, and some decisions you have to make as whatever else is going around. So I feel personally very grateful that and the way it's segmented in SimSys with the four core disciplines of computer science, psychology, linguistics, and philosophy, does really give you that framework for range. And then not only that, so you very elegantly said that it's a launching pad for any interest that you have within those realms. And some of the alumni in Symbolic System have the most interesting careers you could imagine. It feels like there's a trailblazer kind of nature to the major itself because of how quirky and unique it is, but also to the people within it. Do you want to speak a little to the nature of what an average Symbolic Systems career looks like?
Yeah, I mean, one of the other fun things about my job is that I get to brag about our amazing students and alums. So that's actually really a pleasure because, I'd like to think that it's SimSys that adds something exciting to these people, but really the truth is that the interesting people are drawn to the major, and so we really end up with just wonderful folks. And a lot of our early alums say that, well, I didn't know what SimSys was, but I knew that cool people did it, and
Hmm.
so I think that's really true. So we we have a really storied group of alums in tech and in industry around Silicon Valley. Like naturally, being a program that's come up in the last 35 odd years, there are a lot of folks that have come out of SimSys and founded amazing companies like LinkedIn or Instagram. Plenty of others played key roles at places like Apple or Google or Yahoo. So really a lot of the tech pioneers in the Valley have been SimSys majors. There's amazing folks there, and then also lots of really well-known academics actually have come up through SimSys and ended up not just as psychologists or cognitive scientists, but also linguists, speech pathologists, ethicists, computer scientists and human computer interaction, philosophers. So just a really broad disciplinary range to the academic pursuits. And then also a good number doing things more kind of in public service, journalism, kind of non-for-profit sector. So really kind of a wide profile. I mean, tech and academics definitely are two big places, but there's also just an incredible range of exciting careers that you see, and it's always really fun on alumni weekend. People come back and surprise us with the new things that we hear about them doing.
It's one of the best feelings to hear what people have been up to, and everybody's so thoughtful about the decisions that they've made and the paths that they've taken. And inevitably at some point there will be some guest who asks, some non-major guest who asks, so what is this program about? And nobody can answer, and it's the best. And you spoke briefly about the fact that interesting people gravitate toward the major. I felt the same way. One of the things that surprised me is that when I became a part of the program, there was a bit more of a mythology associated with the program, as opposed to, I assumed, the early days when it really was more like, what is this type of thing? Um, and then a few years ago, there was the 30th anniversary of the program event, and I went to it expecting there to be a big cultural difference between, alumni of, the 10 plus years versus very recent grads. And I was very surprised to find that it's the same culture. It's the same, I don't know how to describe it, but it's this very like intellectual, fierce intellectual curiosity expressed through uniqueness and quirkiness. How do you make sense around that? Because that has been puzzling me. Is this an eternal constant of the universe, or is this something about the ideas and the personalities, and what is it that makes this constancy appear?
Well, I mean, I think you can't like SimSys and can't want to study SimSys if you don't like seeing connections between things.
Mm.
Because without seeing those connections, it really is a disparate set of courses. You're saying, well, what does philosophy of language have to do with computability theory? Why am I taking this logic course and then this psychology course or this sociolinguistics course? You know, so as soon as you start looking for connections, of course, they're there to be found and they're incredibly fascinating and fertile. And so I think the folks that you see and that you know that have that common SimSys thread are people who love that connectedness, who just enjoy discovering those connections between things. Um, you know, I was thinking about a conversation I had with an alum the other day, and I was just telling them about, you know, some of the kind of research that I do that's trying to like link babies' experiences to the training data of artificial intelligence. They're like, "Oh my God, that's so SimSys, right?" It's just like the reaction to the connectedness between ideas that might otherwise seem, you know, on their surface seem different. Maybe that's the same thing we were talking about earlier, right?
Mhm.
The idea that you're attracted to the underlying unities and connectednesses between things, even though the superficial sociological, social kind of connotation of those ideas or those domains is so different.
Yeah, and I want to strike the balance also of saying that even though it does sound pretty abstract, that the tangible effects that these interventions have had in our lives, we feel today. You know, the impact of Instagram in the world, the impact of iOS in the world, the impact. Oh my goodness! I mean, like these things shape society, and you know, you hope that the people making these decisions and driving forth these changes have the tools to reason through all the changes that are going to happen. And you also mentioned the connectedness between ideas, which I am a huge fan of. What are some of the most beautiful ideas you've encountered in the program?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I mean, you know, the first thing that comes to mind, and probably it's because we were talking uh, about Gödel Escher Bach. It was honestly Gödel's theorem, Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Right, that's the classic SimSys thing. And I had a wonderful professor, a guy named Andy Arana, who was just visiting at Stanford, but he was a philosopher, and I took a couple of logic courses with him. And then the kind of capstone of the logic sequence that he taught was a course where he just walked us through understanding all of the conceptual pieces we needed to get the incompleteness theorem. And
Mm-hmm.
so the idea of creating a language that was rich enough to express a certain set of
Itself.
propositions about the language, that was just amazing. It was kind of mind blowing and beautiful. Um, and then, you know, more recently, I am really just kind of, uh, I personally am so kind of in admiration of certain technical ideas as well. Like, you know, I'm kind of recently obsessed with ideas about kind of causal inference, um, and the kind of causal revolution for kind of methods for understanding the structure of observational data that have come out. Those sorts of ideas are really um, they're ideas that came up in part through AI and machine learning and in part through statistics, but are now sweeping the social sciences by storm. You know, they're so the idea that we can kind of understand the world through these kind of hidden causal mechanisms that might be revealed by kind of our either our experiments or our kind of inferential computations is really fundamental and powerful and exciting.
Wow. Okay. I want to double click on that for sure, because I mean the just the cognitive exercise of being in dialogue with something like these LLMs um, opens up a whole floodgates of possibility. Just the fact that you can devise all these surprisingly accurate models of the world strictly out of co-occurrence patterns is just a shocking. It should freeze us in our tracks. But then it opens up all these other things that I'm excited to get into. But I do also, before we get into it, I want to also tip my hat to Gödel's theorem, because that was also the deciding factor for me to decide to pick SimSys. I had just taken Computer Science 103, which is computability and discrete math. And in during winter break, I read Gödel Bach, and when the proof comes together, and when you essentially are faced with the conclusion that logic can't prove itself, um, there's sort of it's this awakening moment of something deeper. Okay, so if logic has limits, how do we supplant it? How do we support it? How do we build a world on logic that needs support from other things? And it's a very simple takeaway. Like at the end of the day, it's just a formal system like math, um, like language, I guess. You can't prove yourself. Well, if you say it in the second person, it hurts. But uh, and I think that is one of the central theorems that then you start building this intellectual tower on. That is okay. Um, you have formal systems. Formal systems serve a purpose, and then you have the nature of empiricism, which serves another purpose. And then you have to always be bridging the two, and you have to always be realizing that we're after the creation of a bigger system that won't be able to prove itself. But then you're in the next one, and the next one, and the next one. Okay, that was my little spiel because I couldn't not, do it to good old Kurt. But what are some of the ideas in the causal mechanisms? What is something particular that you saw that are particularly intrigued by?
Well, I think you actually hit the nail on the head by saying, it's so interesting to interact with LLMs and to think about the extent to which they have the same kind of causal understanding of the world that we do. And to the extent that they do, of course, then it has been extracted, it has emerged from these patterns of co-occurrence in language and linguistic data. But it's also just very tough to tell, because in some cases they may really understand the world in this human-like causal mechanistic way, maybe, and in other cases they very clearly don't. But it's quite tough to diagnose that by just interacting with them. You really you push their limits. You can evaluate them systematically in some cases for non-commercial research artifacts. You can actually get in there and in the guts and probe the causal model that's being used. So in part, this causal revolution is both a way of understanding the data that we get from systems in the world around us, including social systems. And it's also a way of thinking about the kind of models that we as intelligent agents, and maybe perhaps some neural network agents, some LLMs and others, have internally, and perhaps not. So as a framework, I think it's been very powerful for me to think about it both cognitively and data analytically.
And I'm sure there's a ton of application in your specific field of research that is child language learning, as in like now we have these digital children that are going through this a fire hose learning method to absorb all this data and compress it into these effectively really small brains that um, we know shows some progress, and we now it really has some effect that there was some threshold that was crossed. Um, and I guess the same thing happens for children, and that same threshold gets crossed. And we're trying to compare the two. Is that what you're saying? Or you're interested in how both of them may be similar, may be different? What are
Exactly.
some what are some of your more standout differences, do you think?
Well, a very first thing that you could think about is just the scale of training data that's
Hmm.
involved. So that whatever that threshold is, where it feels like there are these really interesting emergent phenomena from LLMs, we could argue about exactly where that happens. But for me, one interesting piece of that was when you started to be able to prompt an LLM to give it a couple of examples or even just a description of a task, and have it then do in context learning and be able to complete that task. So that was a very exciting moment. And that moment seemed like it happened, around GPT-3,
Hmm.
more or less. And GPT-3 was trained on several hundred billion examples. And when you go and look at like, when does that kind of in context learning happen for kids? Well, it depends how you measure it, of course. But
Mm.
I think nobody would disagree that like a kindergartner, like a 5-year-old has that. You can be like, hey, have you ever played the
Mm.
game Uno before? Let's play Uno. Here are the rules. And the kindergarten will be like, okay, that's fun. And maybe they'll make a few mistakes, but they'll basically play Uno with you. So they're clearly doing that kind of in context learning with very small numbers of examples and maybe some structured rule like information about the game. So how much data have they got in order to do that? It's way less. It's many orders of
Mm.
magnitude less. If you're just counting words that they've heard, they might have heard, 100 million or a couple 100 million tokens. So we're
Mm.
talking what, three or more orders of magnitude. And so we've tried to work this out. The numbers vary, but it's going to be 3 or 4, or maybe sometimes even 5 orders of magnitude between the LLMs and the humans. So there's something really different about the learning process in those cases. And that's one of the key things that my research nowadays is focusing on, actually, is that data gap between large language
Mm.
models and their emergent behaviors versus the emergent behaviors and representations we see in kids.
Mhm. It's fascinating, and not just in terms of data, but also in terms of power efficiency and how the brain running on what is it, 40 watts, 4 watts, I forget what it is. Well, nothing compared to what it costs to run GPT-4, say. Um, and it's also really interesting, right? There's also the evolutionary components too that drive, pro-social child behavior. We don't really know if LLMs in their simulated evolutionary training runs evolve the same sort of payoff functions that lead humans to behave in the way that we can predict. Um, and the fact that human agents are bombarded with probably more data, but that isn't linguistic in terms of every type of sensory input that the brain or the nervous system processes at any given second. Yeah, I don't know if actually, it would be fun to do the back of the napkin math to see how those compare, right? And then there might be some interesting things of like, oh, does all of human recorded history share some patterns between the growing up of a child or something like that? But then again, I mean, I think we're just doing the exemplifying the a very Simpsons conversation where, oh, this is connected to this and this is connected to that, um, and it's infinitely fun. What are some of the challenges you've faced being at the helm of the ship these past few years with the program?
Well, the strength of the program is also, a challenge, which is that it's such a good program and it's so exciting, and we've grown so much over the past 5-10 years, especially with the boom in AI, that's really been the big challenge. Because when I was in the program, and I hope this is the case when you were in the program, there's a real sense of kind of cohort unity and community that emerged really naturally. I mean, there was some programming, there were some great talks, and the advising fellows, who are our student advisors, organized dinners and stuff. But I got to know people in part because every time I was in a class, I was in a problem set group with the same folks. And so I really got to know them over the course of the program and formed really close relationships. And I think that was a lot easier when we had, 1 or 2 AI classes and you just had to choose that one, and, the one linguistics or 2 linguistics classes and so forth. Um, and in part because, some of these areas have thrived, especially in computer science and AI, we have way more students and more course offerings. And that means the kind of organic connections and sense of community that just emerged doesn't always. And
Hmm.
the sense that everybody's kind of doing the same core and talking about it with each other. And so you're noticing those connections together, that doesn't emerge as clearly. So at the scale we're at, which is now 80 or more majors a year, we really have to work harder to look for connectedness between people, and of course between topics as well. Maybe that's our theme for today, is connectedness. And we need to create paths through the major and sub communities. We've really built out Symbolic Systems 1, our intro course, as a flagship that actually now is offered every quarter, so that
Hmm.
students can really get introduced to the major early on and get a sense for what the intellectual territory is and who are the faculty and what are the areas. And we really need to think about ways to kind of scale some of the great experiences that we were giving people just kind of by virtue of having a small program. So that, I would say that's the biggest challenge. The
Too much
resources.
success.
Yeah. Well, one of the lessons of, maybe this is unpopular to say, but one of the lessons of the kind of massive online course experiment was that educational experiences don't scale that easily. It's hard to give, 100 people the thing you gave 10 people. It requires a lot of care and consideration. And so that's really what we're focused on is, how do you recruit and staff and fund the kind of educational experiences that we really want to give everyone.
And how do you navigate being an interdisciplinary program and being, the curriculum being made up of an amalgamation of different sub-disciplines? How do you manage that, unique position within Stanford that, isn't the case for a major like computer science or psychology or any of the other more single discipline majors?
Yeah, our curriculum is built on the offerings that other departments have. So we're constantly looking at what other departments are doing and how they're thinking about their course offerings, and then trying to build a curriculum that's robust to a little bit of variation in that. And part of what that means is that we offer a lot of different paths through the major. There are relatively few courses that you have to take to be a SimSys major, SimSys 1 being one of the big ones. But for many of the other cases, most SimSys majors may take a particular course, but we build in some flexibility and some optionality so that majors can get through the core in a lot of different ways, and hopefully still get a lot of the same content and a lot of the same experience, but without, if a course isn't offered in one particular department, it doesn't mess everybody up for a year.
Mm-hmm. And what about like offerings for? So I know that there's undergraduate research you can do while as an undergrad. You could do your master's program. What about some of the more academic or continuing education programs that the program has offered, or is maybe excited about offering in the future?
Yeah, so we're really focused actually on giving students research opportunities during their undergrad, and then the master's degree as well, which you mentioned is a smaller program, but that's really research focused. So my conviction is that when SimSys majors do research that's independent and directed, they are really finding those connections for themselves in service of some goal that they themselves have set. And that's really an incredibly valuable experience of synthesis. And it really helps sew together all of those different pieces of coursework and different ideas in the SimSys major. So the university as a whole is moving towards this idea of every student doing a capstone. And we're really encouraging as many of our students as want to, and as we can get, to do that through doing an honors thesis or other kind of research. So this was certainly my experience, was that doing research really convinced me of the connections between all of the different topics I had studied. I was using my knowledge of linguistics and to do psychology experiments to try to think about philosophical issues. And that was so exciting for me personally. But, I'm an academic. Maybe that's not surprising. But I had a student from my lab come back a couple of years ago, and it was a really meaningful experience for me. She said, to be honest, I've never really thought much about like baby language acquisition since I left Stanford. But when I started my job in this kind of like high-powered consulting role, and they said, hey, go away and write a report on this topic and like do your research, write up your findings, like analyze your data, I had no question that I could do that because I had already done it. I knew how to do it. And I knew that I had the confidence to just like independently lead a project in that way. And that was thanks to doing the honors thesis. And that was really meaningful for me because it felt like as a teacher, I was doing something that wasn't just perpetuating, the thing that I love and that I, maybe not everybody wants to be a baby language scientist, but I was really teaching somebody a skill that was valuable for their life, regardless of the academic or industry or public service path they were going down. And so that's really informed our desire at SimSys to try to create those synthesis moments that build skills and create connections for our students. And we've got an amazing group of honors theses this year, actually. I've been really trying to push up the proportion of students that do honors to fulfill their capstone. And this year we've just got this bumper crop of amazing honors projects. They're doing such exciting science, such exciting, in some cases, arts projects, qualitative projects, quantitative projects, theoretical projects. So that for me is just like one of the huge ways that that SimSys pushes research and they kind of academic focus, but also in service of an educational goal.
And what about a graduate degree? Is there a plan for a SimSys graduate degree at any point in the future?
So this has been floated many times. We do have the master's program, and our master's program is wonderful. It's about half coterms and half external master's students. And the real criterion for admission to this program, which is very selective, especially for the external master's students, is do you need something that you couldn't get anywhere else except SimSys?
Wow.
And so when people come to us and they articulate that rationale, they say, I need to study SimSys because I want to blend these ideas that, that's not a CS master's, that's not a econ master's, that's not a psychology master's. That's what makes a really compelling graduate application to us. And it's 2 years long. It's got elements of the SimSys core coursework in the first year. And then the second year is really a research year that lets them go deep and write an original master's thesis. So that's our graduate program right now. I don't know that we're in the immediate future starting a PhD program. I mean, I think a SimSys master's is a really fun thing to have. Our graduates, some of them do get PhDs. I've got a PhD student in my lab now, Alvin Tan, who's an alum of the master's program. And actually one other that moved over from it. But I think a master's in SimSys can enable a tremendous number of different things. And we've got some really prominent master's alums and, in the Valley and in academia and so forth. But a PhD in SimSys is more complicated in part because there's not there aren't other SimSys departments to go hire you. So it puts, if you're pursuing an academic career in some sense, like even if you're studying SimSys topics, and I think a lot of our PhD students are, they still need to get hired by a psych department or a CS department or a linguistics department. And so it's my first priority with the program is serving our undergraduate and master's programs, and really my real priority, is I think SimSys is one of these uniquely Stanford intellectual experiences. And so what I want to do is share that really broadly with the university community. So that when people think, okay, I'm coming to Stanford, it's like, well, I don't know if I'm going to be a SimSys major, but I need to experience this really unique and cool thing that they do there. And so I'm going to take SimSys 1. I'm going to hang out there. I'm going to try out this vision. So that's really, my goal as director is to serve the major community and the master's community, and to kind of project that vision to the broader undergrad community, so that this really becomes part of what Stanford's intellectual, mix is known for.
Mm-hmm. And there's also something to be said about the fact that I've always seen, the symbolic systems as the glia, or like the connective tissue between things. And as you venture farther into the depths of knowledge, and you need sort of these, you need the network to be formed in order to be able to, publish in a given, field. And so, I mean, what field would this even be? You need the core. It's a big lift to create a discipline that is so effusive by nature, right? Like it dissipates in your hands, and like by the time you try to define it, you're going around in circles. And I think there's something special to that too. I think there's something special to it being a more generalist, earlier in the higher education process, as opposed to something that it's not like you're not going to find you probably are these days, but you're not going to find in 40 years ago a library with a symbolic system section, but you probably were going to find a psychology section or something like that. So how do you manage your time, Mike? How we covered so much. There was curricular stuff, there was alumni stuff, there's your research that you're actively doing. How do you wear those hats, and Where is your time spent the most?
I mean, the amazing thing about being in a university setting is that we are fundamentally about our teaching mission. And so the single place where I spend the most time is in working with students and trainees. And that's true, in my classroom teaching, it's true in my SimSys work, and it's true in my research life. So I do get to do a little bit of research myself where I'm literally the one sitting there doing the coding and the writing, the papers, but much more of my time is working with an amazing group of students and postdocs and other trainees. So in some sense, I like, what I do is very diverse, but a lot of what I do is really talking to wonderful people, wonderful students and staff and other trainees.
That well, and I assume like it must be a very complex role. Like um, you're managing people very directly. You're embodying this figure of the leader of a program. You're also you're giving input into the what the requirements for the curriculum are. You're performing outreach to alumni and developing those relationships to have some continuity between current and I think it's just very admirable to now that I was doing the exercise of pre-imagining the conversation with you. I was thinking through like all the stuff that's on your mind, and on top of that, you're still driven by the research mission and the teaching mission, and I think that's really cool. What are some of the things that your research has borne out that you are particularly excited about? The things that tickle your intellect that you are sort of like all giddy about.
Yeah, so I'm at the beginnings of a new project that I'm really excited about, and it doesn't have a lot in the way of findings yet. We're really still at the setup stages, but it's something I'm very excited about. So for the last 10 years or so, I've been pursuing this idea that in order to study developmental psych, in order to study kids and the ways that kids change, especially in the diversity of contexts and cultures that they grow up around the world, we need to have a more collaborative and a more open, data-driven approach. So really trying to foster international collaboration, trying to foster open science and data sharing. Those are the kind of key touchstones for my research. And so this new project is called LEVANTE. And the idea is to create a framework of measures, so tasks for kids to do, and data sharing platforms that allow labs around the world to collect data with kids and then share their data in a de-identified way for other researchers to use. So it's really about creating kind of consensus tools to use in developmental research where the tools are reusable and free and open, and that hasn't always been the case. And also the data that each lab collects is coordinated and shared, and so becomes part of a cumulative body of knowledge that enables new research and that enables the recursive improvement of the tools, and allows a field to really build, as opposed to a set of kind of separate disconnected studies where the data gets locked up and not reused in the same ways, and maybe sometimes isn't reproducible or isn't replicable. So this LEVANTE framework is an attempt to try to create some shared infrastructure while allowing people to kind of remix and do what they want with that infrastructure to serve their own research goals.
That's fascinating. And how far does it go? As in, how do you get into the? Are you trying to also have a say in terms of cultural translations of things? Say, I just assume you're trying to give the kids the same test in multiple different cultures, and you have to make sure that whatever you're asking them or however you're prompting them is a valid translation of the intent with all the good stuff that goes behind it. Are you trying to get into that too, or is it more on like as a tool level and a data warehouse type of situation, or how deep does it go?
Yeah, it's great question. So the idea here is it's really a federated model where there are partners who are using this set of tools, and we're kind of trying to follow an open source development model where there may be cases where we see a key feature being internationalizing or translating a particular piece. Or there may be a community member or researcher from another culture or language group that says, well, I need to make an adaptation or a translation. I need to, change this in order to serve my goals. And we say, okay, well, let's work with you to build within this framework. So I'm really inspired by kind of open source communities that are able to manage a core, call it a product, but your core project, but also have contributions and adaptations and remixes by kind of a broader community that's excited about the goals, but maybe is trying to serve their own aims as well. So that's what we're trying for. In practice, we're going to start with a single centralized product or project that people get to use, and we're going to try to internationalize it, and then we're going to try to grow and scale as we get interest and uptake. And so we're in those early days where we're really doing a lot of design, trying to pilot test this year, and then hopefully next year there'll be a whole bunch of labs around the world that are using these measures, and we'll see what they're able to do with them and what they need in order to do their work.
That's so cool, and I think it's a necessary. I like the idea of revamping the infrastructure of science in general. I think that the current configuration of the distribution of scientific ideas is pretty flawed, in the sense that there's very limited access to it, that you need a certain amount of education to even be able to parse the information, and then you can have distortions, corruption, and whatnot along the way that leads to misinterpretation, intentional, misinformation, and whatnot. And I think a project like this is more along the road of building a more open science ecosystem. And I know that is something that you're also a fan of, and the open encyclopedia of cognitive science. You want to talk a bit more about the promised land of open science?
Yeah. So Open Encyclopedia project is another project in its early days. So has not yet launched, but hopefully this year we'll be launching this new Open Encyclopedia project that creates kind of accessible overviews for students and researchers and the interested public of key cognitive science topics. So you're kind of hitting all the themes, but you're right that openness is a key theme and a key connector for me. So, when I started my career, I think maybe this is very simplistic, but all I wanted was to write kind of formal theories or models of learning and of kind of language acquisition. And I did that in my dissertation. And by the time I was done with my dissertation, I realized like my theory wasn't that far advanced, but I had already run out of data. And, the data that I was looking at were not that solid. I was kind of trying to wrap my theories around these little findings with just a small number of children in an experiment in one university town, something like this. And this really coincided with a real awakening in psychology, where we started to recognize that actually, a lot of psychology findings might not be replicable in other contexts or even in the same context. Maybe there were flaws in the statistics or flaws in the code and data handling that led them to be kind of shaky findings or false positives, as we call them, just, accidentally recognizing noise and thinking that it's a real signal. So a lot of my professional work has been centered around trying to respond to that, trying to get more data and more robust data and data that are shared more broadly and more permissively. Because, for me and other theorists or would-be theorists around, it's so frustrating to know that a data set has been collected that could be a test bed for your theory, but it's locked up because somebody wants to publish more on it, or is encumbered by something, or maybe they just didn't get around to posting the data. It was hard to clean up or something like this. That's a very frustrating situation to think that, I'm going to redo that effort of collecting new data, often at great cost, tracking down kids, wasting their parents' time, putting a camera on their head, or, showing them a task or bringing them to a lab or whatever that thing is, just because there was a barrier to sharing. So this idea of openness is about reusing that effort and pooling that effort across the community, creating data sets that become a test bed for theory. There's one like little extra benefit there, which is then the more people participate and reuse their data, and these are researchers and actually families, and the more people are contributing from the more places and the more backgrounds, the more diverse and variable those data are, and the better you represent the range of human experiences that you want. So open science creates a diverse and representative science as well. And I think that happens at the participant level. It also happens at the researcher
Mm.
level, where you decrease, as you said, barriers to access, barriers to getting knowledge. So this is the kind of like this is the dream world, the virtuous cycle of open science, where you really have an ecosystem in which participation is encouraged and progress is cumulative, and the research that's produced is both more representative and more robust.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, there's something to be said about the replication crisis in psychology. That we want to move forward in the world, assuming that the signal that we collect is valid. It's a terrifying thing to know that the some of the assumptions that we make, especially as we have more effective power over our environment, over our society, that we are taking wrong decisions because of often misguided reasons for not sharing. And I think that like there's now, especially that we have such a long-standing proof of success from open source communities, Linux, Bitcoin is another huge example. They're valid proofs that organization can take place, emergent organization can take place, and become a sufficiently good alternative to the alternative, I guess, that it really does spark the question of why don't more things model that? And of course, that is also like on the perhaps overly optimistic side. But personally, I'm very happy that you're working on it, and I personally think that if you publish a paper, you should also publish the data behind it, so that you can, if you want to replicate the experiment and the methods, anybody can do it. Otherwise, it feels a little bit like grading your own homework. Um, and with that said, Mike, do you have any pearls of wisdom for anybody who might be listening as we wrap up? What are some techniques you found along the way to find the connectedness between things?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the the thing that I've always done is just to commit to the thing I'm doing with a belief that that connectedness will emerge as I think about it, and as I reflect, and eventually when I kind of get my head out of the water. Like I think that the kind of classic Simpsons major dilemma is that so many things are connected to so many things, and you kind of can't choose, and there it's all really cool. And what I guess I feel is that if when you immerse yourself deeply in one problem, that that problem really can reveal those connections in a much richer way. And then as you kind of resurface, you can change again. You can commit deeply more than once, and that's been very powerful for me. That I go kind of deeply into one interesting area, and then I emerge and I see how it is reflected in other areas. It gives me a perspective, and then I shift again. And that was true in my kind of early academic career, where I was sort of trying to find a home. Like I was in SimSys, and then I actually switched over and did a bunch of literature and literary studies, and considered music, as I mentioned. And but it's also been true at a more micro scale in my research, where I go deeply into one approach or one idea, and then switch, and then go to another. So I think that idea of committing deeply for a time
Hmm.
is really what I would suggest for folks. And I think it's the world feels so exciting right now. It can be hard to do that commitment, but it is very rewarding.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Mike. I really appreciate the time. I look forward to a follow up conversation, hopefully sometime soon.
Well, it was great to chat with you. Thanks so much for inviting me.
You got it.